Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico.
Matt, the waiting is over. The Advent is almost done. Yeah, we're recording this on Christmas Eve. It's so close. What's the vibe in the old Bernico household?
We're hanging our stockings with care. We are wrapping these presents. We're leaving a carrot outside for Rudolph. And here's the big one. We're making sure that the Scottish Krampus doesn't come to town.
Is there a Scottish Krampus?
There is a Scottish Krampus. He has a Gaelic name that I can't remember or pronounce. And here's the thing. We're laying out booby traps. We've got the handle of our front door is glowing red hot as we have connected wires to it. We've got a paint can waiting to swing down and smash him in the face. We're putting broken glass on all of the floor. This Krampus can't come in.
Yeah, you know, your son does have real Kevin McAllister energy, so I believe it. I think that's great.
That's a great point, actually. a great comparison I've not really thought of that much, but that's exactly right.
That's great. Over here in Canada, we don't have those kinds of old-timey traditions. Instead, what we do get to celebrate is that the Liberal government gave everybody a tax holiday, a tax break throughout the holiday, which is so funny. They're really desperate. They're trying to buy people's votes out here before the election will inevitably come and they will lose. And man, it's such a...
They should try harder to buy the votes.
It's such a funny conservative strategy to be like, we lowered your taxes at Christmas time, please vote for us. Anyway, we're all enjoying that. Every restaurant has a sign that says it's the HST tax holiday, you should come eat here. So I guess we're going to do it. We're going to take advantage of it this year.
Well, couldn't hurt. I mean, if it's not taxed, you might as well get out there. Are you going to go to that good Indian place by your house? You should do that.
Okay. The one that you're talking about is definitely the best one, but we're going to go to a different one that we've never been to. We're going to try it out this year.
Okay. That's fine with
me. So that's what we're doing. That's our big plans. We're all getting ready for Christmas on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. But how's this for a segue, Matt? Around the world, though, including in the Catholic Church, people are getting ready for the Jubilee year, Jubilee 2025, which officially begins to begin. Hard to say, really. It begins tomorrow on Christmas Eve when Pope Francis opens the first of 4 great magic Jubilee doors that if you want to really do the Jubilee right, you're going to have to visit all 4 of those in Rome over the next year. And the first one, he's opening it tomorrow. It's a big deal. Everybody's excited about it. We all can't wait for him to open the big door that never gets open, that's always closed. And I'm pretty excited about that. I don't know if that's been on your radar, Matt, but it is all I've been able to think about for months and months and months, actually, in my job.
Okay. That's interesting. That's an interesting fact about your life, that's all you're thinking about. I like that. It's not on my radar as a Protestant. No one has been telling me about this, which is too bad. I did see a TikTok video today where I learned that the magic door, the first of 4 magic doors that is being opened tomorrow is cemented shut. Did you know that?
Mm-hmm. I did know that.
It's like, are they so worried that someone's just going to open it accidentally that they've cemented it? That's crazy.
Steal some extra grace, unsanctioned forgiveness?
I don't think so.
Okay, that is crazy. Another thing that's really fun is, so there's a church that I think you saw the outside of, but when we were in Rome, I went inside of it, and there's a door there that is an emergency Jubilee door. So if they can't open one of the doors, if they can't open one of the doors, they'll open the emergency door. So, you know, if they can't get all the cement off, they'll be okay in the end. There's a backup plan.
That's such good news to hear, that there is a backup door, just in case that the door gets stuck. I mean, when you're sealing doors with cement, I don't know what you should expect, really. It might get stuck. It's just the fact of the matter. Going through the 4 magic doors is an RPG quest.
It is.
In Catholicism. What happens if you go through all 4 of them?
That part, I actually don't know. I'm not sure. I've never done it, but you know what? Maybe I will try to do it next year. The one reason that I've never felt pressure to do it is you can kind of cheat by going through other magic doors more locally to your own area, and I presume they kind of do the same thing. I'm really not sure, so who could say? but the Jubilee year, we'll talk about this more in a minute, but it is a time in the Catholic Church where you can get some special mercies, special dispensations of grace. You can get your indulgences. You can shave some years off of your purgatory sentence or someone else's. It's just a great time to kind of be a Catholic and to visit these magic doors. So I have to imagine if you do complete the ultimate quest, the main quest of going through all 4 magic doors, I don't know, maybe you get some bonus indulgences at the end. I'm honestly not sure, but I'm sure someone is really concerned that people know about it. So you can go find them.
Just to make sure, just for the people listening at home, I'm not interested in this at all, and I'm not going to go through any magic doors. But do like most basilicas have these magic doors? I guess where could somebody find one locally if they wanted to?
That's right. You got it right. Most basilicas have a magic door, so we'll have one here in Toronto, for example.
Okay, there is a basilica, a proper Catholic basilica over here in Glasgow, and I'm not gonna. I mean, as a Protestant, I'm not gonna go through, but I might just go take a look just to see what it's doing out there.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll see dozens of people queued up to go through it. I'm sure it's going to be a really popular kind of door.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. Cool. Well, tell us more about Jubilee, Dean. We got to know the whole scoop on this great magic year full of magic doors.
Yeah. All right. Listen, there's a lot of magic going on next year, and I think that's great. I think it's fun. It's great to have one more weird thing in Catholicism to talk about and deal with for a year. But in addition to the magic stuff, there's a lot of material stuff going on in the Jubilee year. And people might remember that 25 years ago, there was another Jubilee year. And it was a moment where the whole world really mobilized to try to get some justice related to global debt issues. At the time, the Global South was in a huge debt crisis, and it had been brewing for years. And throughout the 90s, people were organizing around this all over the world. And by the time they got to the new millennium and the Jubilee year, all this stuff kind of like came together in a really unique way. And the Jubilee year also became like a kind of moment for lots of Catholics and other Christians too, though, to get involved in calling for debt cancellation for countries that needed it. And guess what? 25 years later, there's another debt crisis, and just doing it once didn't solve it. So this upcoming year, in addition to going through all the magic doors, people are also going to try to mobilize again to kind of restart that conversation around debt justice, looking at even more structural issues around, why is there a debt crisis again 25 years after this huge, massive push? So we can talk about all that in more detail in a minute, but I am pretty excited about that. I think that it's a unique moment because people will talk about the Jubilee because the Catholic Church is going to make a big deal out of it, but there's this material component to it and piece of it that I hope will also be kind of amplified as a result of all these other things that are going on, the other activities happening in the next year.
Yeah, sounds rad. The magic doors are great, undeniably so. I love a magic door that exists out there in the world. But forgiving and restructuring debts so that they are, more just or whatever, seems better, even more exciting than the magic doors somehow.
Yeah, they're sort of magic doors of their own, if you think about it.
I'm thinking about it. Yep, you're right.
So we thought, listen, I'm telling everyone to listen a lot to me in this podcast. I don't know why this time around, but I'm just really commanding everyone's attention. We usually this time of year will do an episode around the Christmas season somewhere or other. A few years in a row, we did like several episodes throughout Advent, and you can listen to all those. They're all great. But this year, we thought for the big Christmas week podcast, we would talk about the Jubilee. And to coincide with Pope Francis opening the big magic door, you can kind of think of this episode as our own opening of the podcast magic door. I think that's going to be a good way to start off the year, to open our own magic door here right now. And we welcome everyone to pass through it by listening to the episode all the way to the end. I think that's how you get the special Magnificast indulgence this time around.
I don't think that we have the authority to give anybody an indulgence, but I'm going to go ahead and say you can do a little sin if you want to. Just like a small one. One that's not too big of a deal.
Yeah, like you can... I'm not even going to suggest it. It's a Jubilee year. I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to have to go to the magic door because I told someone else to sin, so I'm actually going to hold back on that. Yeah. But I think for us, the Magnificast indulgence is more like this Christmas, just have that extra cookie, you know? It's not Lent. It's Christmas time.
Have over here in the UK, we got all kinds of golden coins, and you better believe I'm eating these golden coins left and right. Yeah. Yep. So
that is a Jubilee year, a Jubilee meal fit for a king. Golden
That's coins. Right. Money, pay it back? No way. I'm eating it.
Sort of the weirdest Scrooge McDuck. So let's talk about the Jubilee for this episode, Matt. I have like so much to say about it and so much content, probably too much. So I feel like I'm just going to have to rely on you helping me organize it in such a way that it makes any sense to anyone else. When I say that I've been thinking about this for months, I mean it. I've been thinking about it in my job for months. I've been working with other people around the world to try to like figure out what can we do around debt justice for a long time. And man, I'm so excited about it because I do feel like it's going to be a chance for people to really connect their faith to some material issues, and not only global sovereign debt, but also other debt issues, student debt, housing debt, healthcare debt, all these kinds of debts that are very bad. The Jubilee year is kind of an excuse to be like, hey, let's think about this, Christians and non-Christians alike. So, Matt, you're going to have to help me funnel all that into something meaningful to others.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Great. So we've done an episode on the Jubilee in the past. I can't remember when, maybe even a year ago or so, related to an issue of Jesus Magazine, RIP, that dealt a lot with the Jubilee. And I wrote a piece for it. I think you had one in there too, right? You wrote on Graeber's debt.
That's right.
At the time.
Yeah.
A great issue all around. And so you can listen to that if you want to learn more about the biblical Jubilee. That's kind of what we were talking about then. So we won't maybe rehearse all of that, but it probably would be good to go through the basics of it. So I thought maybe we could start there and then work our way up to the Jubilee year 2025. In the Bible, there's kind of like a few places where it starts in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 15, Leviticus 25, and there's like a handful of other passages where there's kind of like a social law that is, I don't know, ideal in the Old Testament, though it rarely gets activated, if ever. It's that basically every, on a fixed kind of cycle, every 7 years, there's a Jubilee year, but also every 50 years, there's a big Jubilee year. And the spirit of Jubilee kind of has like three big features in those two books, in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. They are more complicated than this, but I'm going to say the ideal parts first, and then maybe we can talk about the ambiguity in a sec. Mm-hmm. The ideal parts are, in those years, the land is supposed to be allowed to rest, the slaves are allowed to go free, and debts are canceled. Those are the three big kind of features of the biblical Jubilee. I don't know, Matt, what do you think about that? Is that something you heard about at all, being a Christian growing up in the church, etc.?
Growing up, I don't have any actually big recollections of that happening, but if it did, it would have been like, oh, you know what? No, that's not true. Hang on, I take that back. Ever since we decided this is what we were talking about for this podcast, I've been thinking about, there's this one praise and worship song that talks about the day of Jubilee, and it's, yeah, I know, but it's not like you'd think. It's like, just sort of like, it's more of an end times moment in the song.
Right.
Where the day of Jubilee is the one where you see Jesus coming down on a cloud, and just like Goku. So anyways, quite different than what you get in the Bible. Just sort of like, evangelicalism is mostly vibes based, and that song is definitely vibes based too. Just like a lot of biblical references shoved into a song. And I guess that's it. But yeah, quite different than what you see in the actual Bible, where you get, I don't know, the themes that you said for sure. But the thing that always sticks out to me about about Jubilee from like Deuteronomy and stuff is that at least in Deuteronomy it says like, if you follow these rules, then there won't be any poor people in your society, which is a really a big claim, and I don't know, maybe not exactly true, but really interesting though that there is like a structural like valve to get rid of poverty, or at least ideally, a pretty interesting thing to have in a religion like Judaism, and kind of be adapted in a religion like Christianity. So, anyways, all to say, no, I didn't really ever hear about it growing up, or if I did, it was in a very weird way.
I feel like I remember hearing about it when I was an evangelical in high school, but the catch of it was that, like, this is in the Bible, but humans are so sinful that they could never really do it, and they never really did it as a result.
Right.
That was something that a Bible study leader, I remember, explaining to me, which I thought was very strange, because the Bible doesn't say you won't be able to do it. It just tells you to do it. And I thought it was a very funny way of, like, sneaking out of that by being like, yeah, well, the Bible sets up an impossible demand that you're not allowed to accomplish. Anyway, a classic evangelical strategy. But I thought it was interesting that it's kind of present in some way, at least in popular Bible study teacher brains, at least, but not in detail.
Haunting Bible study teachers everywhere. The impossible demand that kids will definitely ask about and say, isn't that kind of like socialism?
That's
not great.
So I mentioned these things, the ideals. They have some ambiguities. For example, when slaves go free in the Jubilee year, there's like a pretty yucky clause, which is that if they're Israelite slaves from your own community, they go free, but other slaves, you don't have to worry about them. They can stay your slaves. There's something similar with the debt cancellation, that you're supposed to cancel the debt of the people in your community, but you don't necessarily have to cancel the debt of people outside your community. So there's a kind of, I don't know, ethno-nationalist piece of the Jubilee. But what's fascinating about the biblical text is that this concept of the Jubilee kind of picks up steam and develops throughout the Bible. And I should say, too, we talked about this on the other episode, but the idea of a Jubilee is not unique to the Bible. It's found in lots of ancient societies. Other societies outside of Israel did, in fact, cancel Jubilees, and it's like a long-standing thing. The Bible didn't make it up. But what the Bible did do is it kind of expands this idea of Jubilee throughout the course of the Bible. So, for example, there's some truth to the evangelical kind of suspicion that, nobody could really pull this off. In the ancient world, as I mentioned, there's evidence that some kings did, in fact, do this, and not even for altruistic reasons. Like, a king might cancel debt because they don't want the creditors to get too powerful, or lots of other reasons. But in the Bible, you kind of see the biblical kings, they never really managed to accomplish a Jubilee year either. And the voice of the Jubilee ends up being in the prophets, who are constantly calling people's attention to the spirit of the Jubilee, or the year of the Lord's favor, as it comes to be known. And that's kind of like tied up into the messianic tradition. And as the biblical story is developing, the dream of the Jubilee, that you would have no poor among you, starts to really like get ratcheted up in terms of God's demands on the kingdom of Israel. And by the time you get to Jesus Christ, all that stuff really comes together in a big way. And in fact, his very first public speech, or the announcement of his ministry in Luke 4:19, is a quotation from a passage in Isaiah that is a Jubilee passage that ends by saying he's proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor. And Jesus says, the scripture has been fulfilled in your presence, or in your hearing. So he's basically saying, I've come to declare the year of the Jubilee here in ancient Rome. And that is something that I never heard at all, for sure, in evangelical church, but lots of other places as well. And it's something a lot of kind of historical critical biblical scholars are interested in, and kind of left-wing Bible scholars will make a lot out of it. But it is right there in the Bible itself. The Bible doesn't seem to be like hiding it. And the idea that Jesus is inaugurating that Jubilee year is really fascinating, because it kind of, where the Deuteronomy and Leviticus stuff kind of circumscribes the Jubilee into like one ethnic community, by the time you get to Jesus, the Jubilee is expanded to be this kind of like pretty revolutionary invitation to all people who are orbiting Jesus to come and get in on this. Like, the year of the Lord's favor is here, and everybody's welcome at the table. Samaritans, Romans, Jews, Greeks, whoever. And that is a pretty cool development. So that's kind of the biblical tradition. I don't know, Matt, any other pieces of that we should get on the table here?
No, I think that's great. I mean, Jubilee is one of those ideas that has been folded into Christianity biblically, like you said, but you see bits of it kind of crop up all over the place through, medieval Christianity and different types of like left-wing Christians that pop up from time to time. You see these ideas kind of coming again and again. Something that kind of struck me when you were just saying that, though, was how easy it is for so many people to kind of like misread that theme in the Gospel of Luke. When you hear about the year of the Lord's favor, people, sometimes Christians, especially evangelicals, will just be like, oh yeah, that's whatever that means, and just kind of keep going, and they don't kind of like recognize the political importance, the kind of thing that's going on behind the scenes there, just because they're bad at reading the Bible or whatever. So anyways, yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, sometimes it even gets rolled into prosperity gospel stuff where it'll be like,
right,
the year of the Lord's favor is, getting the blessings that you get from God, or he's going to make you rich, or even in non-prosperity gospel settings, I've heard evangelicals kind of appeal to that text to say if something's going well or whatever, they might kind of draw from that language, and it really evacuates the political history behind that text, which would have been pretty front of mind to the people hearing Jesus declare that in occupied territory. I
do remember a handful of times in evangelical settings where I would hear a sermon about tithing, and right. if you give 20%, God will multiply the amount of money in your bank account, and that's just science. That's basic economics right there. It's kind of like the moral of the story. But that language, about the Lord's favor, kind of being like the activated to talk about prosperity and being, receiving a blessing or something in a particular way. So yeah, I don't know. Evangelicals love to take something that actually has a lot of economic and like political background and take it and just sort of like twist it into a different economic and political background that's worse, I guess.
That's
great
right.
Stuff. Yeah, thank you so much, evangelicals, for that.
So that's the biblical Jubilee, a cool thing that few of us get a chance to kind of encounter as a very cool thing in Christianity, but it's right there. It's there in the Bible. You can check it out. You ought to check it out. But there is also this thing called the Jubilee year in the Catholic Church. And the first Jubilee year ever was in 1300. So it's pretty old. It's an old tradition. But it's kind of, like everything, it has changed since then as well. And it's on a bit of a schedule. So the Jubilee year is basically, it happens every 25 years. It used to be the case that it happened every 50 years, but for centuries, it's been on a 25-year cycle. And you can predict that it's going to happen every 25 years. And this upcoming year is one of those Jubilee years, so it happens on the kind of quarters throughout the century. You can technically have a Jubilee outside of that cycle. For example, Pope Francis had a Jubilee of Mercy in 2015 that he just kind of had, or just called, outside that cycle. And typically, the Jubilee year is a year of kind of spiritual significance or receiving special mercies. So the maybe negative way of reading this would be to say, well, you don't get the material Jubilee, you don't get released from your money debts and so on, but you do get this kind of spiritual Jubilee, the release of from your spiritual debt, which is probably important, but maybe not a great consolation prize if you're still a debtor living in a debtor's prison or something. But you can see, especially in the last couple of Jubilees in 75 and especially in 2000, there's been this attachment to the spiritual side, a political side, and a material side. And even someone like Pope John Paul II, who is a complicated guy, if you're interested in things like liberation theology and so on, he became a pretty strong proponent of releasing the material debts of countries in the global south who were being oppressed by them during a debt crisis at the end of the last century. And I think that actually has set up a pretty interesting precedent where by now it's pretty hard to talk about the spiritual Jubilee without also finding some language to talk about the material pieces of it. And of course, that is also not only unique to Catholics. In the 2000 Jubilee, there were a lot of Protestants who were invested in that as well, and lots of non-Christians too. It was like a global movement. But there's this kind of sense that 25-year cycle, because the Catholic Church is so big and has so many people around, and because it kind of asks people to do something that year, to go through a magic door or to kind of reconsider their spiritual life as a time of renewal, I think it's also become a bit of a like, okay, this is an opportunity to get debt on the agenda and to talk about these structural problems, just like the biblical Jubilee is already talking about. So it's not really inventing it, but kind of rediscovering that side of it, which I think is pretty good. And that's what we're gearing up for tomorrow.
It sounds great. I can't wait for the big day. Can't wait to get through those doors. Oh, no, sorry. I have to keep up the act that I'm not going to go through any doors. Definitely not too Protestant for that. Tell me more about what happened in 2000, though. A bunch of debt was canceled in the year 2000. What happened with that? I guess what was the conclusion of that story?
So the Millennial Jubilee, or Jubilee 2000, it is like often even taught today in social movement classes and so on, is a pretty unique moment of global organizing and mobilizing. Like millions of people signed a petition around the world calling for debt cancellation, which was brought to many different fora, and in the end, they did succeed. They, at that time, in 2000, most external debt, so like debt that a country owes to another country, most of it was held by public creditors, which is to say either bilaterally, like the government of Canada or the United States or whoever would lend to a country in the South, and that would be a bilateral kind of public debt, or by kind of multilaterals like the IMF or the World Bank, which are, you know, like made up of creditor countries, of government representatives and so on. So a little bit different than like, I don't know, some other kinds of creditors that are out there, which we can talk about more in a minute. So at that time in 2000, most debt was publicly owned. And that made it kind of easier to organize around because, you know, you ostensibly at least have a bit of a say on how those public creditors feel or act. You know, you can like go to your finance minister and be like, I think it's bad that you have so much debt with, like, you're the creditor of, I don't know, some country struggling in Latin America or Africa. You can be like, you should just cancel that. It was a big deal, a huge campaign. Bono, he got in on it, for better or worse. A lot of people still love to talk about Bono being into it. A lot of celebrities kind of joined onto it. But there was a real kind of grassroots push for it as well. Lots of Global South movements were heavily involved. And it was a fraught kind of coalition, lots of disagreements, arguments, and so on. But it did ultimately achieve in canceling over $100 billion in external debt. But it had this really weird twist where in order to qualify for getting that debt cancellation, if you're a poor country, you had to also agree to all these economic terms and conditions, which basically repeated what we often refer to as structural adjustment programs run by the IMF and World Bank, which is to say, if you wanted to get your debt canceled, you had to structurally adjust your economy in different ways in order to make it more flexible for private capital and foreign investments, which often means austerity budgets or defunding public healthcare or public transit, all these kinds of things that are already pretty hard to fund in the South. If you wanted your debt canceled, you had to like continue that path. So it's a mixed success. Like on the one hand, it's great that they convinced the creditors to cancel these billions of dollars. And I think that like people should count that as a victory because people have basically told themselves that that's impossible. And we know that that is not true because they achieved it. That's very good. But they did it, you know, again, with this kind of twist that reinscribed the injustice that has led, in many cases, to a debt crisis in the first place. So it's a really interesting case study of both, like, an extremely cool global solidarity movement and all the complicated stuff that happens as a result of that, and also a great lesson in, like, the kinds of victories that you can win with, you know, a giant broad-based coalition going against capital, which is to say, like, pretty complicated victories.
Yeah, right. That makes sense. Do you know anything about, like, how it became very popular? Like, that grassroots movement part, like, what were people doing on the ground to, like, get people into it?
Yeah, it is different in every country, as you could guess. One benefit that they had in 2000 that we don't have right now is that throughout the 90s, there was already a lot of organizing around the debt crisis. And it was like, even creditors agreed that something had to be done. Like, it would have been a huge blow to the global economy, and already there were some kind of ripples happening as a result of like Mexico defaulting on its debt, for example. Lots of stuff. Like, it was a bit of a powder keg. So people were ready for something to change. And because there had been years of folks organizing around it up to the year 2000, when they finally organized this kind of global campaign, which also lasted a few years, like that debt cancellation happened in 2004 and 5 and a little bit on. When that started happening, they had the benefit of like all this other stuff that had been done. So in Canada, for example, churches throughout the 90s had been organizing like popular education workshops all across the country, where they would invite people to come and learn about debt for like a whole day. Basically, they'd have like a day-long workshop. Yeah, extremely cool. So you'd come, you'd like have lunch together, you'd have dinner together, you'd be playing games that tell you something about debt, you'd be doing Bible studies together. Like, it was a pretty intense period of organizing. And so by the time you get to 2000, people are already sort of primed to like have that conversation and spread it around. In other countries, it's different. If you're in a heavily indebted country, for example, you kind of already know that there's a debt crisis because it's affecting your life in a pretty direct way. I was talking with somebody from Argentina this year who was saying that in the 80s, when he was a kid, the radio would they would have these speeches that would try to explain to Argentine citizens how much money they personally owed to the IMF, which is extremely funny and a great idea.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so kind of like breaking down the national debt per capita and being like, this is how much money you have to pay back to the IMF. I love that. So, that's like in the global south, it's already sort of something that's front of mind for folks and they're organizing already. But for the north, it took a lot of work. Yeah. And I think by the time you get to the Vatican endorsing it and Pope John Paul II being like, let's do it, he had already been kind of signaling that since 97 or 98, I think. So there was a lot of planning, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. And we're kind of in the opposite situation now, where it's more of like, hey, let's start talking about this again and see what we can do.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, then, that being the case, do you want to talk about the aims of like Jubilee 2025? Like, are you as ambitious? Is the plan to do the same thing? I mean, what's different about it this time around?
Yeah. There are plans to do similar but more things, and I think there's a sense that people want to learn from what didn't go well in 2000, or what could have been improved, I guess, but also draw on the lessons that did go well, including things like popular education is so important. Helping people kind of understand what's going on with that is important. So maybe we could start with Pope Francis, actually, because he released a papal bull last May of this year, called Spes non confundit, which means hope does not disappoint. And in it, in section 16, he has a whole bit about the debt, which I'll read in a second here. Basically, the bull is like an announcement of the Jubilee year and an explanation of what Pope Francis hopes to get out of it. And like I said, it's not only the debt cancellation stuff, lots of other stuff going on in there. You can read the whole thing if you want, but the debt cancellation stuff is pretty good. So maybe I'll read out what he says, and then we can pause and talk that through for a sec. He says, echoing the age-old message of the prophets, the Jubilee reminds us that the goods of the earth are not destined for a privileged few, but for everyone. The rich must be generous and not avert their eyes from the faces of their brothers and sisters in need. Here I think especially of those who lack water and food. Hunger is a scandal and open wound on the body of our humanity, and it summons all of us to a serious examination of conscience. He goes on to talk about defunding weapons and so on, lots of other stuff. He then says, a heartfelt appeal that I would make in light of the coming Jubilee is directed to the more affluent nations. I ask that they acknowledge the gravity of so many of their past decisions and determine to forgive the debts of countries that will never be able to repay them. More than a question of generosity, this is a matter of justice. It is made all the more serious today by a new form of injustice which we increasingly recognize, namely that a true ecological debt exists, particularly between the global north and south, connected to commercial imbalances with effects on the environment and the disproportionate use of natural resources by certain countries over long periods of time. That's a quote from Laudato Si, by the way. He says, as sacred scripture teaches, the earth is the Lord's and all of us dwell in it as aliens and tenants. If we really wish to prepare a path to peace in our world, let us commit ourselves to remedying the remote causes of injustice, settling unjust and unpayable debts, and feeding the hungry. So that's the big material vision Pope Francis is casting for 2025. Matt, what do you think? Are you ready? Are you ready to get through the holy door and then really come out psyched about debt justice?
Yeah, I'd go through the door for this one. First of all, anytime Pope Francis, I guess anybody, starts talking about the who the goods of the earth belong to is always such a cool thing to me. Within Christianity, there's sort of an anti-property philosophy that I think people don't poke at enough, and I like that a lot. So that's cool. The other thing that I think is actually quite interesting about this is that there's actually kind of a flip about debt and justice in this piece. There's debt between governments, right? The government borrows from some multilateral organization like the IMF or whatever. That's money. That's a debt. But there's also this other type of debt that is between the global north and the south, which is an ecological debt. So it's like I don't know. There's debt in the world as we know it, but then there's also like an ecological debt in the world that has to be figured out somehow too. Anyways, it's kind of interesting because it's not just like the global south. They're in debt as always, as we expect or whatever. But there's actually another type of debt going on, and that is the global north to the global south based on the types of production and consumption that we got going on up here.
Yeah, exactly. I really like that kind of flip as well, because like the economic debt is something that can literally just be forgiven or canceled or abolished or wiped away, however you prefer to talk about it.
Right.
And that's fine. Like we could just do that because we would choose to do it. But the ecological debt is not something that can be just wiped away. Like it is a debt that will be paid. Definitely ecologically, in terms of like if we see the climate as a bit of a creditor, like you can't actually push that loan off. The payment comes due in terms of global warming and so on. But in terms of the kind of financial piece of the ecological debt, that is something that also can be ignored, like countries won't pay into the loss and damage fund for the South, etc. But that too will kind of continue to rack up the ecological debt that is going to come due at some point. So I think it's like helpful to sort of also identify which debts do we have to pay and we don't have the luxury of forgiving, and which debts do we need to forgive or release in order to get anywhere else.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you put it like that. Yeah, one debt is definitely made up, and the other debt is real in a sort of ecological planetary limit kind of way. The global north has written a check that its tush can't cash, if you will.
I will. From that great economist Otto Rocket.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think it's a compelling vision that Pope Francis is casting here, and it might also help, though, to talk a little bit more about the current debt crisis and where this papal bull sits compared to 25 years ago. And then maybe we can also talk about some of the proposals for kind of delivering on this instead of just saying they're good ideas. So I mentioned earlier, 25 years ago, most credit was held by public creditors. That is like, or most debt owed by countries in the South was held by public creditors. And it is a different situation now. There is still, first of all, a lot of debt that is held by public creditors, and I think people forget that. It's important to recognize that hasn't gone away. But there is increasingly more and more debt that's held by private creditors in some cases, and with some countries even more that's held by private creditors on the whole than public ones. And that is really challenging because with, let's say, if Canada holds the debt of another country, you can go to the Canadian government and say, I want you to get rid of that. If there's like a hedge fund that owns the debt of another country, you can't go to a hedge fund and be like, you should listen to me, because they'll be like, I don't care who you are, and I don't have an obligation to do that. So it's a much harder terrain to organize on. And it really depends on finding creative ways either to appeal to those creditors or to force them to play by different rules. The latter being the the more obviously sustainable path, but also the way harder one to achieve. So that's one piece. There's a different kind of terrain. There's also kind of 4 big reasons that we're in a debt crisis now, and I thought maybe I would just briefly go through them, and then we can stop and talk about them. The first one is probably the easiest one to wrap our heads around, which is historical colonialism and dispossession. Countries that have to borrow tend to be countries that have always had their resources extracted and exploited. And the irony of them having to borrow is that they're borrowing money from countries that have sucked a ton of value out of them in the first place. So it's a really bizarre arrangement, a colonialist arrangement. For example, if you're, a country that like for centuries was forced to be a monocrop country so that you could like send all your goods back to whatever, Spain or England. And then all of a sudden now you have to like get money from those countries. It's a really bizarre reversal. They should be owed reparations, but they don't get those. So that's one big piece. The debt crisis is happening because of this ongoing historical dispossession that has depleted a ton of value from countries that then have to go borrow from creditor countries. Another is the 2008 financial crisis. This is like maybe a more economically technical thing, but I think it's pretty fascinating. So the 2008 crisis, as people might recall, it had a lot to do with mortgages and the market and a certain kind of debt problem. And one way that the market kind of dealt with all of that is that lending rates in the global north were extremely low, in some cases basically zero. So if you're a creditor and you want to make money, you can't really lend in the north because you'll never get any return on your investment. But who definitely always needs money? People in the global south. So you could lend to the south, and they did it at quite high interest rates because the south are desperate for cash. So as a result of, and that's also why you saw the increase of private creditors kind of taking on external debt, because they're basically like, where can I make money? I'll make it off of these other countries. So that prompted a ton of lending in the south that was pretty rough, and those countries took it. Later on, by the time you get to COVID-19, the pandemic obviously slowed a ton of economic stuff going on. And if you're an indebted country already struggling to pay your debt, you're definitely going to struggle even more if people can't go to work or can't, your economy is kind of like ground to a halt or stalled. So that continued to exacerbate the debt crisis. People were not able to pay. In some cases, creditors did provide some suspension of payments for a while, but not a cancellation of them, just kind of like you can skip a couple months of rent or whatever. And then lastly, there's been a ton of inflation, first from the war in Ukraine, which had a huge impact on like cereals and grains and all that kind of stuff. It super raised the cost of those basic goods. But then also you can think of all the global rate hikes from the central banks that have happened in the last year or so, which has had a knock-on effect, kind of compounding all of these, all the debt crisis in the global south. So all 4 of these things are kind of like a bit boring maybe, or like a bit technical, and I'm going through them extremely quickly, but they are really different from the kinds of factors that were at work in 2000. And in part, they're different because they're more complicated. And trying to like explain to people why a country is in a debt crisis now is hard, because people will default to all the stuff you usually hear, like basically racist tropes about being like, well, they shouldn't have lent if they knew they couldn't pay it back, or, a country like these people are lazy, they'll never return a loan, all that kind of stuff. Or like, if you took the money out, you definitely should pay it back just out of responsibility. And all of those stories kind of ignore these factors. For example, a lot of that lending after 2008 was definitely predatory. A lot of the kind of external factors like COVID or inflation, those are things that you can't predict, and they're not built into debt contracts, right? Like there's no mechanism for a loan to a country that says like, if your country goes through a global pandemic, then like we'll change the terms of your your loan. Like that's not there. So lots of external factors that have basically created a situation where entire populations are in a bind because their governments owe other people cash. And just to kind of put a fine point on it, there was a study from UNCTAD, the UN Commission on Trade and Development, called A World of Debt. That's pretty good if you're a data head. And it says that 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on paying off the interest of their debt than on either healthcare or education. Whoa. Which is to say nothing about like climate investments and all that kind of stuff. So like the debt is holding back, entire populations from going to school, going to the doctor, surviving climate change, all that kind of stuff. So it's a pressing problem. Okay, I'm going to stop. That's a lot all at once.
It is a lot, and it is a pressing problem, but it is such a frustrating thing to think about how, I don't know, an entire country's well-being when it comes to healthcare or whatever, something like that, something that benefits a universal good that would benefit all people in the country is hampered or derailed or whatever because all of the money is going towards servicing a debt. That is so frustrating. It's like such a made up and imaginary problem that it does make you want to scream or at least walk through some magic doors to, I don't know, free yourself from it. It's crazy. Just a weird imaginary problem that a group of rich people have said applies to a bunch of poor people. It sucks.
It does suck. It sucks. It's very frustrating. It reminds me too of somebody I heard in a meeting in the past year from Africa was saying there's a great speech from Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary of Burkina Faso, who was assassinated. He delivered this speech where he said, this is in the 80s. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, I guess, because it's in French, but he said, if the creditors don't get paid back, they won't die. We know that for sure. But if we pay the creditors back, we will die. And we also know that for sure. And it is like as simple as that, right? Like if the creditors don't get their money back, they're going to be fine. They, especially in this case, these private creditors, they'll survive. They'll continue to be rich people. It will not be a problem. They basically will like not miss it. Like nobody's going to go hungry because a country can't pay their debt back to a hedge fund. Or even for that matter, back to like a government or a bilateral kind of debt. However, on the flip side, if these countries continue to pay their debts, they are choosing not to invest in healthcare, education, etc. And it's already having ramifications. People might have seen the scenes in Kenya over the summer, for example, where over 60 people were killed protesting the Kenyan government because they were going to raise taxes on Kenyans explicitly at the recommendation of the IMF so that they could pay back their debt to the IMF. And young people in Kenya, bravely and rightly, were basically like, why should we, as average Kenyan people who are already struggling to make money, why should we have to basically give more money to our government, which will inevitably just leave the country and go back to creditors somewhere else and never come back to Kenya? And, they were willing to put their lives on the line to say no to that kind of policy. So it's, these kinds of things are literally life and death matters, both for kind of structural reasons, but also these kind of immediate tensions that they produce in different countries.
Yeah. Wow. So interesting. I gotta tell you though, even if not paying debts back did like kill a hedge fund, I think that's fine.
Yeah, of course. But that's the irony of it, is like it won't even do that. They would be fine. We tell stories about creditors as though like they're just honest people trying to get by or whatever, but that is not the case with gigantic economies exploiting smaller economies, or hedge funds exploiting poor countries and so on.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, what's okay? Those are the problems. That's like the crisis. What's the solution? What's the Jubilee 2025 big bumper sticker policies that they want to do to I don't know, alleviate debt, cancel debt, do something with all this debt?
Yeah, there are three big kind of asks around it, and I think that they are pretty good as far as they go. I think there has to be more done than this. Obviously, capitalism is bad, it's got to go, all that kind of stuff. But in the absence of that happening tomorrow, I think these things are pretty good. So each of these things has been reiterated actually by Pope Francis in the last year in 2024, which I think is pretty fascinating. He's kind of like given us a body of suggestions to take into the Jubilee year that work, I think, pretty well. The first one is to cancel or remedy unjust and unsustainable debt without economic policy conditions. That's like the first demand.
Cool.
The last
just
clause,
cancel debt is great.
Yeah, it's so great. Just do that Jubilee thing, get rid of the stuff. No economic policy conditions. That's great. One thing that's really fascinating is there's also a lot of countries in the South that are like fine with not canceling their debt. They would rather have it restructured or kind of, have their loans rewritten, and they don't mind paying them back. Like, that's been a really interesting sort of tension in the development of the campaign in a global way. But I think what's really fascinating is that, like, the whole point is to say countries in the South should be able to determine for themselves what they want to do. And they should have access to an outright and total cancellation of that debt or whatever they feel they need to do to make their economies work. But that's the first item. Get rid of this debt stuff and do it without imposing austerity and so on. The second one is to attack the root causes of the system or address the root causes of the debt system. So the kind of like headline of it is to transform the financial system in a way that puts people and planet before profit. And I think like it can sound like a pretty vague demand to say we should transform the international financial architecture, but it is something that debt movements in the South have been talking about for years and years, and they have lots of suggestions on how to do it. For example, maybe it shouldn't be legal that you can just lend at extremely high rates to countries that will never be able to pay it back. Like maybe there should be a law about that, a kind of globally recognized law that is binding and so on. Or there are other kind of features of the way that lending works that could be changed. For example, it could be the case that every sovereign debt kind of loan or term of agreement should also include stuff around like climate shocks or pandemics or kind of clauses that ultimately recognize that the people on the hook for the debt in the end are regular people. They're not, like international debt is not like your household or something. It's like somebody who lives in the middle of nowhere will be impacted by this forever. And right now, debt clauses they're not written in that way. They're written in such a way that basically favor creditors getting paid back. So lots of kind of different technical solutions there. And the last item is establishing a debt framework at the United Nations. There's lots of frameworks at the UN. I think it's one of those demands that is like kind of frustrating because the UN is ineffective at preventing genocide, for example, or stopping climate change, or like all these other things that we think the UN ought to be able to do. But at the same time, it is the case that there's no universal structure for international lending. Just to give you an example, like if you're a person or a company and you're in debt trouble, you can declare bankruptcy and restructure your debt. But if you are a country, you actually can't do that. There's no way to do it. There's nowhere to go to do it. So the idea is maybe you could have something in a more political space like the UN that would allow you to do that rather than like having all these backdoor conversations with creditors. So I think there's something to it, even though it has its limitations. And those are the three big items. Cancel the debt, change the system that creates debt crises, and get something going at the UN to deal with it when inevitably there's a problem. I think they're, like I said, incomplete. There's always more that you can do and say. But as far as a global campaign goes, I actually think it's pretty ambitious to be like, a lot of actors are going to ask, for example, creditors to cancel the debt of countries in the South. And I think that rules. That's a pretty big ask.
Just for the sake of my own curiosity, I guess. So the first two asks, canceling the debt and transforming like the financial system to kind of deal with like the debt that you were talking about. What are the mechanisms that I guess you're trying to influence? Is because, like you said, there's not like a sort of neutral party out there like informing all of these things. Is it just like talking to creditors and getting them to do things differently, or is there some other like is there some other like big bank out there that you can lobby to make these new rules? I don't know. How does that happen?
Yeah, it is very complicated. I think there's a variety of kind of venues. For example, there's places where people talk, where countries talk. Like we talk about the COP meetings on the environment. Things like the G7 meeting or the G20 meetings, those are places where countries come to talk about economics and lots of other things too, but often economics. And that is kind of one place to say we should be able to have a political discussion about the effects of debt. And insofar as countries have a hand in that debt situation, they should also exercise the power that they do have to alleviate it, which in some cases are probably, you're not going to get a great hearing with Donald Trump on that one, I don't think, for example. But maybe you could get the UK, for instance, which participates in the G7 and G20 to think more about that. So that would include things like releasing the debts that they themselves own, and they do, either directly bilaterally or through these multilaterals like the IMF and World Bank, where they sit as countries. And then secondly, there's a really wild situation where a lot of private creditors are regulated in the state of New York specifically, and then also in the UK. Just because of the history of stock markets and all that kind of financial stuff. So there's a lot that can actually be done in those two places, in New York and in the UK. And that'll be another place to say, all right, let's get some stronger regulations, tighter stuff around regulating all this. And then the final bit would be when a country needs cash and someone approaches them offering them cash. Because there's no universal set of rules or even best practices or whatever, you can't really compare it and be like, well, as a creditor, for example, are you signed on to this or that like set of principles or treaties or whatever that means that you won't, squeeze us if we get hit by a typhoon or something like that. They basically just have to be like, I don't know, what is this creditor giving us? If it's money, we need it, so we'll just take it. So I think that's one last advantage of kind of having this space at the UN to be like, could we work out some framework by which countries could have a bit more of like an equal footing when it comes to negotiating a debt contract. And right now there's a bit of a creditors cartel. If you want to read a really great book on it, there's one by Jerome Roos called Why Not Default, which asks like, why don't countries just quit paying? And there's a lot of reasons, but one is that creditors basically hold all the cards and they have to keep paying. That's the short of it. But if we had a political situation where you could build more united will across countries, it would shift the balance of power a little bit there, such that you wouldn't just be dealing with whatever the creditors give you, but you could actually have a more globally agreed upon set of standards that you could talk about. So those are the three big things. Public creditors can do stuff, private creditors can get regulated, and internationally countries should be able to like kind of compare notes and figure out who's getting a good deal or not. Yeah.
Dang, that's so cool. Talking to your coworkers at work about how much you get paid is a powerful move. And I guess if you're a country, the same thing goes about your debt policy. That's great. Well, okay.
Right.
Here's the other big question, I think. You've laid out the crisis, the asks, all these things. And, in the coming few weeks, probably the coming year, people are going to be walking through the doors. And what do they do after they walk through the doors if they want to get involved in this kind of thing? Is there a link? Can people go to a link and sign up for this? Or like what's the deal? How do you become a part of this big grassroots movement?
Yeah, well, there's lots of actors in the space, and I think one way to do it is just find out who's acting in your space and figure that out. Most likely there's somebody who's going to be talking about it. It's like I said, a global campaign and people are going to push it. There is one website that kind of collects it internationally, which is called turndebt-into-hope.caritasinternationalis.com. We'll put it, or .org, I guess. We'll put it in the show notes. You can go there if you want. But I think the most effective thing, like I said, is figuring out who's organizing where you are. For example, in Canada, it's not only the Catholics who are doing it, but there's tons of Protestants who are in the mix, and even some people in labor and so on who have an interest in the debt crisis. So I think it's one of those things where you if you're really interested and you start poking around, sending some emails, you can get connected up with whoever's doing it. And I think that it's an exciting year. People who participated in the Jubilee 2000 to this day still talk about it as being a transformative moment in their life. And I think that has to do not only with the power of organizing, but also feeling like you're part of a global push to like make a pretty deep transformational change. And I think this is the kind of thing that won't get won in a year. Like, all these demands are pretty big and they'll take a while to achieve. So I think getting in on the ground floor is good. And it will also require people who are willing to like have the more radical or prophetic voice in that campaign speaking up with it. So yeah, go to that website, but also ask around and get into it. It's going to be a big campaign.
Get into it, says Dean. This has turned into kind of an interviewing Dean sort of episode, and I guess that's okay.
That's all right.
When it comes down to it, you know about this and I don't, and I think that's cool. So I've learned all kinds of great things about global debt and what to do. So I feel good about it. I'm ready to walk through at least one door. I've changed my tune since the beginning of this episode. I'm ready to walk through one door, and I'm definitely ready to erase global debt. For sure. The door, I mean, I could take or leave, I guess, but the debt is something I'm pretty set on erasing completely.
Well, get ready, because, Matt, I'm going to force you to read so much stuff about debt in the next 12 months because I have to read it. So by the end of this year, you and everybody else who listens to this podcast is going to be pretty knowledgeable about debt. So buckle up.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. If you do that, you can join our cool, behind the paywall, members only Discord channel where we talk about, I don't know, the church fathers and what they have to say to you about any given situation. We got memes, we got podcast recommendations. We have a group of people who are just willing to kind of hang. And isn't that nice? It sure is.
A lot of Mangione discourse right now, if that's the kind of thing that you want to get spicy about on the internet.
That's true, yeah.
Also, last year, we announced that we were going to read the whole Bible in a year. And guess what? Like all good Christians, we didn't do it. Okay, 2 people in the Discord did actually achieve that goal. They are Cal K and Altona. I don't know if I'm reading their handle right, but whatever. That's how they choose to be identified in here. And they did do it. And they deserve, I don't know, a great medal or something that we haven't
It's incredible. You can't tell right now, but I am standing at my desk and I'm clapping for these 2 people and their great perseverance of reading the big Bible. Yeah, I gotta tell you, Dean, I'm not sorry. This has become an extended version of the podcast now. I'm not starting over. I'm going to pick up where I left off because there's no way.
Wow.
There's no way I
what
can.
What a coward.
There's no way I can read Kings again or. Oh my gosh. No, I can't do it. I need to get past it. So if I'm going to do this, I'm going to pick up right where I left off last year. We all have our own Bible path to walk, and mine is not reading the boring parts again.
That's fair. You know, maybe we'll all pick a part after the Torah to start, see how that goes, or after Kings and Chronicles. Who knows? Yeah. The key here, though, is also, like all good Christians, we will recommit to reading the entire Bible in a year, which will inevitably fail again in the new year. And there's a great channel just for sharing Bible stuff in the Discord. It's been really fun to watch throughout the year. People kind of share different resources. I've learned a bunch of stuff in it, found some cool stuff I would never have read without it. And it's also been fun seeing the folks who did keep with it pull out some interesting stuff that when you read the whole Bible, man, you notice some weird things that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. And it's a cool place. So you can get in there, you can read the Bible with some other weirdos for the next year until you get sick of doing it like the rest of us. And who knows, then you can pick it up maybe in year 3. You'll finish it. Hard to say. But it's in there. You can join it. Patreon.com/themagnificast. All right. Our outro is by the Illogical Spoon, and our music's by Mario Armstrong. And we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.